a large chunk of the British public thinks that we could be self-sufficient in gas if we just drilled more gas from the North Sea. But, we've done some analysis, and actually the North Sea Transition Authority's own figures show that even if you were to approve all of the kind of commercially viable new gas fields, the difference that would make to our import dependency in 2050 is a difference between 94% with those new fields and 97% dependent on imports without them. The best days of the North Sea Basin are really behind it. And so, again, if the UK can't make the decision to draw a line in the sand, manage this transition, make a very intentional effort to shift towards renewables and to also use it as a benchmark for climate leadership, then I'm really not sure which country can.
Hello, I'm Bryony Worthington, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest this week is Tessa Khan, founder and director of the UK-based charity Uplift. Trained as a lawyer, Tessa is currently focused on how to increase the pace of the UK's transition away from fossil fuels. She founded Uplift to provide a counterpoint to what she saw as the undue influence of the oil and gas lobby on UK climate and energy policies, with a specific focus on phasing out extraction. She and Michael were on a talk show recently where they sparred with Richard Tice MP, the climate change denying deputy leader of the UK's Reform Party, about net zero and the future of the North Sea. So I was delighted to have an opportunity to learn more about her important work on this subject. Please join me in welcoming Tessa Khan to Cleaning Up. Tessa, thank you so much for joining us on Cleaning Up. I wanted to start, as we always do, by giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself in your own words, please.
Thanks so much, Bryony. It's such a pleasure to join you. I'm a long-time listener and fan, so delighted to be on the show. So I am currently the executive director, and I'm the founder of an organisation in the UK called Uplift, which is a research and campaigning organisation that's working towards a rapid and just transition away from oil and gas production, in particular in the UK.
And you're a lawyer by training, aren't you? So just tell us a little bit about what led to your setting up of Uplift.
Sure. So, yeah, I did. So I grew up in Western Australia, and I started my career there as a corporate lawyer, but I had always had an interest really in working on issues of social justice and human rights. My family is from Bangladesh. Most of my family is still in Bangladesh. And so from a very young age, we spent a lot of time there, and I was just quite acutely aware of social and economic inequality and the way that the world is a difficult place to explain from a kind of justice lens. But I did my kind of initial stint in commercial law in Australia and then pivoted quite quickly towards international law and started, I worked for a short while in prosecution in a war crimes tribunal in The Hague. And, that was fascinating, but ultimately, I was very interested in what drives conflict and didn't really want to be in a position where I spent my life kind of addressing conflict after the fact. And so, that led to an interest in, I guess, development and human rights, and spent a number of years in Washington, D.C., working for the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative, which is effectively an international human rights and sort of development program that supports. I worked on food security, public health, and also climate change from a kind of human rights lens and equity lens. And it just became increasingly clear to me that if you're serious about human rights, climate change is the biggest systemic threat to the enjoyment of human rights and really the biggest threat to all of the development gains, I think, that have been experienced globally over the last few decades. So that became an increasing focus, and I was involved in the negotiations, as part of the civil society contingent of both the Sustainable Development Goals, and my organisation also did quite a lot of work in relation to the Paris Agreement. And I think I started to become a bit concerned that we were going to end up with, some flagship agreements that created important new milestones, but like so many of the conventions and treaties in the international human rights space in particular, do very little to actually incentivize action at the national level because of the lack of enforcement mechanisms attached to them. But I think about 5 years ago, I realized that it's really important, I think, for us to recognise that ultimately so much of this is a political and policy challenge, and that courts have a role to play, but that, you know, we have to win the politics. And that's become, I think, acutely evident in the last year or so, if we're going to have any realistic shot at meeting our climate goals. And I'd moved to the UK in 2019 and really saw an opportunity here because of, I think, the genuine climate leadership that the UK has exercised, to potentially demonstrate how the UK could also be a leader and a global first mover in oil and gas phase out, because at the time and still it continues to produce a significant amount of oil and gas from the North Sea. So that was kind of the genesis for getting to Uplift.
So let's sort of pause and talk about that relationship then, because obviously, you know, the Climate Change Act, the UK, you know, guides UK action, really focuses, like most climate treaties, on emissions, you know, terrestrial emissions, what we currently emit. But what Uplift focuses on is the supply side of the equation. So not the what we burn, but what we dig out of the ground and we make available to be burned. And tell me a bit about what made that particularly interesting to you.
Well, in short, the power of the oil and gas industry to influence climate policy and ambition more broadly. And I did listen to the episode recorded recently on cleaning up with Ben van Beurden, the ex-CEO of Shell, which I enjoyed. But I think it was indicative, and I think Michael, you know, rightly pushed him a bit on this notion that the oil and gas industry is just meeting demand and is otherwise a neutral market player, when there is reams of evidence to show that the oil and gas industry in particular has been an incredibly powerful force for shaping ambition that governments have, for shaping what markets look like, shaping demand ultimately, and that, you know, I mean, there's plenty of evidence that organisations like Influence Map and others have accumulated billions of dollars spent on lobbying against climate policy post the Paris Agreement being adopted. And in the UK, again, I know Michael's been really vocal about the lobbying by the gas boiler association and industry against, you know, misinformation that they've promoted about heat pumps. You know, this is an industry that has, and in the UK in particular, I think really significant political power as well. So that's one reason why I think it's absolutely crucial for us to address this side of the equation. But then, of course, you know, the other reason is that there is a limit to how much fossil fuel supply we can have if we're going to stay within climate limits. And, you know, the conventional lens has been to look at it, as you say, through territorial emissions. But in the last few years, we've had reports and projects like, you know, the UN Environment Programme's Production Gap Report that actually quantifies how much fossil fuel supply we can have and burn and still stay within those internationally agreed limits. And the indications are that, you know, on current trajectories, fossil fuel supply that is expected to come online by 2030 is twice what we can burn in a 1.5 degree world. And, you know, UCL, for example, just published a study last month that made it very clear that the oil and gas in existing reserves, if burnt, would take us past the 1.5 degree limit. And the IEA and others have also, you know, come to similar conclusions that makes it very clear that actually we have to limit supply, or otherwise we're going to end up with a heap of stranded assets, or you have an industry that is betting against us staying within those internationally agreed limits. So I think between the sort of need to curb and confront the political power of the industry and the market power of the industry, as well as, you know, the physical limits to what we can create in the way of production of oil and gas, I think those are all really compelling reasons to also tackle that side of the problem.
And you'd moved to the UK, and I mean, I think, you know, when you were setting up Uplift, you did quite an analytical job, didn't you, of working out what are the right conditions to find a country where this possibility of addressing supply is even politically possible. So tell me a bit about what led you to thinking the UK was a good place to start.
Yeah, so I was inspired by some scholarship by Greg Mushett and Sivan Cartha that was published in 2020. But basically they looked at principles that you would apply if you were trying to think about what a fair transition would be on the supply side globally, looking at the profiles of different countries, because we spend a lot of time, I think, in the climate community talking about which countries should move first on an emissions reduction side, but not on the production side. And so, if you look at factors like relative contribution to GDP, relative contribution, to other kind of economic indicators like jobs, the existence of alternative industries or livelihoods for people in that workforce to move away from, the overall kind of economic capacity of a country to support a transition, because it is going to cost money. The UK really, and whether or not, this is a country that actually has a domestic oil and gas industry, so does it have skin in the game? On all of those indicators, the UK, in my view, is by far the most compelling and example of a country that should move first, because the UK's oil and gas industry has been in decline for about 2 decades. And so, even at its peak, it was, I think, about 7 or 8, it contributed about 7 or 8% of the UK's GDP. But right now, when the oil price is low, it's sort of 0.2%, it's less than 0.5%. The UK's tax take from the oil and gas industry as a result of lobbying, an incredibly effective lobbying job by the oil and gas industry that has resulted in some of the lowest headline tax rates in the world for offshore oil and gas. The tax take from the industry has been negative at times in the last decade. Obviously, that changes when the oil price increases. But
sorry to interrupt your flow, but just on that point about the negative tax take, because I think there were periods where the offshore boom of the North Sea was providing money into the rest of the economy, but that started to shift. And what made it go negative? Why was the government suddenly paying out to the industry?
So the overall regime for governance of the North Sea industry was reformed in 2015 in the UK, and that was after a downturn in production. As I said, it had been in decline. It's in geological decline for a number of years, but the government undertook a review that was overseen by a former oil magnate, Sir Ian Wood. So maybe not someone you'd necessarily trust with designing a fair settlement between the British state and the oil and gas industry. But, his recommendations were to create a new statutory mandate for the oil and gas regulator, which is now known as the North Sea Transition Authority, which is to maximise economic recovery of offshore oil and gas. That still exists as its principal objective. But it also led to a reform of the UK's tax rates such that basically the sort of headline rate of corporate tax that the industry pays is about 40%. But there are a number of tax reliefs that are built into the system, including, for example, decommissioning tax reliefs and investment allowances, that mean that there have been years when individual companies in the sector as a whole ends up having more paid out to them in rebates than they pay into the exchequer.
And that's partly because it's an old field, right? So there are old rigs being decommissioned, and I think it's actually that there's almost an unlimited liability on the public purse if those decommissioning costs get out of control. We pick up the tab rate. That's also part of the regime.
Yeah, exactly. Over the next couple of decades, the UK taxpayer is basically on the hook for tens of billions of pounds in decommissioning costs. And this is all necessary, because we've got in an old, expensive basin, you have to incentivize production somehow. And the oil and gas industry's proposition was to do that through the tax system. So it's really a tax system that is designed with that goal in mind, rather than, in our view, a bunch of other energy and policy goals that should shape fiscal policy in the UK. So, that's changed somewhat because of the windfall tax that was introduced in 2022. And, we can maybe talk a bit more about that. But, when I was thinking about setting up Uplift, it was just so clear on the face of it that this was an industry that had a really limited economic contribution to the UK. Certainly if you compare it to somewhere like Norway, where it contributes about 20%, again, depending on the oil price of GDP. the headline tax rate in Norway has been 78% compared to the UK's 40%. And even with the windfall tax, the effective tax rate in Norway has been significantly higher than that in the UK. And we know as well, of course, famously, that Norway's managed to build $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund off the back of its oil revenues, and the UK has got very little to show.
So that leads you to thinking UK is a good place. How much did the fact that we had an emerging new offshore industry play into it as well? And that offshore wind has been the story of the last 2 decades of that expansion.
I mean, it's a huge part of the picture because, of course, this is about transitioning a workforce and supply chains. It's not about shutting them down. And we're in this amazingly fortunate place where actually there was some mapping done by Robert Gordon University recently that showed that 90% of this skills in the offshore oil and gas workforce are transferable to offshore renewables in the UK. So there is that opportunity for a transition. There is a massive appetite. Recent surveys of the offshore workforce have also showed that actually people are pretty fed up with how precarious that work can be. There's a huge number of layoffs after the oil price crashed in 2020. There's a lot of interest in making that transition, and offshore renewables are the obvious place. And similarly, the supply chains can pivot to support offshore wind in particular as well. So the alternative exists. The economic case, I think, is strong. And then, of course, in addition to that, I think you have climate leadership and a commitment to taking action on climate change that also makes the UK a really promising first mover. And, if you look at the way that the UK has committed to really creating international momentum around other norms, climate norms, like the Powering Past Coal Alliance, it was a co-founder of that initiative. Obviously, when it hosted the COP in 2021, it helped establish a new sort of commitment to ending export finance for fossil fuel projects. I think the UK does kind of end up putting a bit of diplomatic muscle behind these new benchmarks when it itself commits to them. And I think there's a huge opportunity and I think a reasonable expectation that the UK would do the same if it made a commitment to end oil and gas production on a line, in line with climate goals.
Just to be sort of devil's advocate a little, I mean, if we're still consuming oil and gas, this is the argument you'll get placed against this argument is we still need to power our cars and our factories with oil and gas. How does it benefit us to turn off our own supply when we're just then going to be takers of product from other countries?
Yeah, I mean, that was an argument I think that came to the fore, particularly in the UK in 2022 after, Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused a massive squeeze on global gas supply in particular. And I think, the oil and gas industry globally at that point felt emboldened to make that argument in every country that it was producing, that it's crazy to turn off production when global supply is volatile. And what we actually learned, I think it's not to give away how the story ends, but, that was the period that led to the imposition of a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry. But what we learned, in that period was that, first of all, UK production is not something that the government can control insofar as these are private companies that will export their product to whoever on the global market or, wherever they think they can get a good price for it. And, the UK's gas production is linked to a regional market. The oil that it produces, so more than about 80% of the oil that's produced in the North Sea ends up being exported. It's not suitable for UK refineries. So, if we buy it back, we're buying it from a global market like anybody else. We also export about 50% of the gas that we produce. And then crucially, because of the volumes we produce, we don't make any material difference to the price that we pay for it by producing it domestically. And that was something that became very obvious during the gas price crisis because, UK households actually, because of our exceptional exposure to gas dependency, because of gas heating in UK homes and the proportion of gas that we use to generate electricity, the UK had the highest household energy bills of any country across Europe. So it really didn't make a difference in a moment of real fossil fuel supply crisis to have our own domestic industry.
And I guess this is a peculiarity of it being a completely private system, right? In many other countries, there's a national oil company that's presumably being price regulated, to kind of keep the economy protected from price spikes, whereas we are just purely exposed, right, to that global price that's set by global demand.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the UK government hasn't had a stake in an oil company, since the 80s. So it really doesn't have any control over the commercial decisions that those companies make. It's another reason why ultimately, with, for example, proposals by companies like Equinor, which is, a company that is trying to push forward the development of the largest undeveloped oil field in the UK, the Rosebank oil field, the profits that Equinor walks away with, especially given the tax breaks that, according to an assessment that we did in conjunction with WWF Norway, it shows that basically Equinor walks away with the profits and we're left with a net tax loss of about £200 million. So it's sort of a redistribution of wealth from the UK's natural resources to Norway.
And that's really clear, right? That the again, Norway similarly, we have no special arrangement with Norway where we can negotiate the price that we buy from them. So it literally is a wealth transfer from everybody in the UK who's heating their home with gas to the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, which, as you said, is now $1 trillion and rising. So it's an extraordinarily we're very dependent, and it's not a particularly healthy arrangement. And then when you think as well that Norway itself is starting to reduce its demand for oil because it's electrifying its transport system very effectively because it's more efficient and cleaner and better to do so, you kind of feel like it's like a naivety that we think this is a healthy relationship, and it's actually really quite predatory, and we could get off it, right? That's the other exciting part of this equation, is that there is now an affordable alternative that means we don't need this dependency.
Yeah, and that is the true path to sort of energy security and energy independence for the UK, is getting off gas in particular. And I think, the other thing that we've tried very hard to communicate publicly, because again, and this is another reason why I think it's useful to have an organisation that's just focused on oil and gas, because the oil and gas industry is so effective at shaping the public narrative, briefing MPs, briefing politicians. But, you would think, and indeed there's polling that sort of suggests that a large chunk of the British public thinks that we could be self-sufficient in gas if we just drilled more gas from the North Sea. But, we've done some analysis, and actually the North Sea Transition Authority's own figures show that even if you were to approve all of the kind of commercially viable new gas fields, the difference that would make to our import dependency in 2050 is a difference between 94% with those new fields and 97% dependent on imports without them. It's indicative of how little gas there is left. It's marginal, and even the oil and gas regulator has said that new licenses would only make a difference around the edges. The best days of the North Sea Basin are really behind it. And so, again, if the UK can't make the decision to draw a line in the sand, manage this transition, make a very intentional effort to shift towards renewables and to also use it as a benchmark for climate leadership, then I'm really not sure which country can.
So let's focus then in on that political moment of the Labour government coming into power with a manifesto commitment to ending the licensing of oil and gas. And so talk to us a bit about how that came about and how resolute that kind of commitment is. Is it holding up?
Yeah, so that was a huge milestone, I think. I don't think any country that has the oil and gas resources, comparable oil and gas resources to the UK, has made that kind of a commitment before. And that was in their 2024 manifesto before the general election here. So it's a commitment to end new exploration licensing. And that was after a couple of years of, I think, the public really waking up to the fact that the oil and gas industry has made these massive profits over the course of a couple of years, when gas prices in particular have driven up household energy bills. And there was a real sense that this wasn't an industry that was working for the public interest. Plus, I'd like to think that, the Secretary of State for Energy Security, Ed Miliband, has a pretty clear grasp of the facts of fossil fuel supply, and also understands that there's very little to be gained from an energy security perspective from continuing to produce more oil and gas. And, one thing that we often highlight is the fact that even with hundreds of new oil and gas licenses issued by the Conservative government in the last decade or so, the jobs supported by that sector have halved. So that's about 200,000 jobs that have been lost, even with new licenses being issued. So that's kind of indicative of just how much there is to be gained from continuing with new licensing. So that was a really important moment. And so far, that commitment has held. The government is currently consulting on how it implements that commitment, and crucially, what the sort of broader package of policies will be to support that transition for the North Sea. And it's due to publish its kind of response to that consultation, I think, in the autumn sometime. So we'll see. But, one thing that was really striking about the document that the government was consulting on was that it was clear that it wanted its position to be aligned with 1.5 degrees. And as I said, the science is pretty unequivocal about the role for new oil and gas investments in a 1.5 degree world. I mean, I'm in no way underestimating how challenging the politics could get between now and that being, genuinely embedded in the UK's legal and policy framework. But I think it's a huge, huge step forward.
And so that's no more exploring for new licenses, right? That's just basically saying this is now transitioning out. But there are, of course, existing licenses that have been granted that have yet to get to the final decisions on investment and development. And so there are going to be these projects that come forward. And you mentioned Rosebank. There was the Cambo oil field as well, where the decision is not about new exploration. It's about, should this go ahead as a project? And there's been a decision, hasn't there, about how you evaluate the environmental impact of each of these new projects that are coming forward for final licensing. Talk to us a bit about the new guidelines that have been produced in the UK, which are pretty radical, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the manifesto commitment just deals with the exploration licenses for new areas that could potentially yield more resource. And then there is this additional set of resources that have already been licensed, where companies have their licenses already and they're waiting for a final development consent, which would allow them to begin extraction. And there's actually about, in our estimation, about 4 billion barrels of oil and gas equivalent, or oil equivalent in those areas that are waiting for that final development consent. So it's material. And so there was a decision in the UK Supreme Court last year as a result of a case brought by a woman called Sarah Finch, who was challenging an onshore oil and gas well in Surrey. And what she argued, and what the Supreme Court agreed with, is that the approach at the time of environmental impact assessments for oil and gas projects, not taking into account the Scope 3 emissions from those projects and just looking at the climate impact as being limited to the emissions caused by extracting that oil or gas, was...
So Scope 3, I'm sure everyone listening knows, but Scope 3, just to be clear, is the embedded emissions in the product that will be released once that product is banned, right?
Exactly. And what the Supreme Court stated was that it is inevitable. Indeed, it's the point of extracting that resource to burn it. And so to not take into account the environmental effect of those emissions is unlawful. That's resulted in the government having to rewrite its guidance for environmental impact assessments, and it published just recently what that new guidance will look like. And again, our analysis is that this is world leading, in that it does mean that now, for an offshore oil and gas project to be approved, the regulator will need to take into account the Scope 3 emissions. So that's big. But in addition to that, the guidance is quite stringent in addressing some of the oil and gas industry's favourite arguments that they use to minimise the impact of those emissions. So, one thing that the industry likes to do when it's talking about the relative impact of a new oil and gas field is to just say, well, this is only 0.0, to look at the volume of emissions created from that field in comparison to global emissions, which obviously makes it look totally negligible. And instead, what the guidance, the new guidance now requires is to look at the overall trajectory for emissions that's required in a 1.5 degree world and to set it against a global emission trajectory and a global production trajectory. So that's crucial.
Just to unpack that slightly, so what they're saying is this is not, you can't just view this in isolation of the projected demand curve and also the projected supply. Your arguments that this, because at the margin, you're basically adding more in a declining demand profile, and that has to be taken into account.
Exactly. And the other argument that is addressed is what's known as the market substitution argument, which the oil and gas industry often uses, which is to say, oh, well, if we don't produce the oil here, it'll just get produced elsewhere. It's an argument that was used a lot in the UK in relation to the Whitehaven coal mine. You know, the idea that if we didn't open up a coal mine here, the global coal market would just find a way to supply the coal from elsewhere. And there's, again, scholarship that shows that actually the effect of keeping oil in the ground is to reduce global emissions from oil production. So that's not a credible argument. But under the guidance, the onus is now on an oil and gas developer to show that actually, if, for example, they weren't to develop Rosebank, that it would lead to an oil project going ahead elsewhere and that would, cancel out the emissions from that. So it's a pretty rigorous and credible approach to assessing the impact of Scope 3 emissions. And we now just have to wait and see how that's applied in practice. And one of the first projects that it will be applied to is the Rosebank oil field in the autumn.
And that will be applied in the sense of it weighing into the decision to proceed, or will it just mean that there's a financial implication, or both?
No, it will mean that so it's something that the Secretary of State will basically have to take into account in making a decision to approve or reject the field. So Equinor, the developer, will now have to create an environmental statement for the field that addresses those new guidelines and provides all of the data that's requested. And then the Secretary of State will look at that and make an assessment about whether or not the environmental effects are such that, the field should be rejected.
Could it flow that it could be approved, but then a requirement is made to neutralize or to compensate for those emissions in the Scope 3? So could the embedded emissions suddenly create a financial liability on the producer, like that they suddenly are now responsible for offsetting or for neutralizing those emissions? Is that possible?
Yeah, so the guidance requires credible evidence from a developer of a mitigation measure if they claim that there is a way to mitigate the emissions, so to offset, for example. So again, the onus is on them to make it clear that that's a plausible way of addressing the emissions impact. But yes, I mean, it's possible that, one thing that the UK oil and gas industry has talked about for a long time and not done a huge amount to actually implement in practice is electrification of oil and gas fields, so that you end up reducing the upstream emissions impact, because instead of running your oil rig on diesel, you're running it, using a wind turbine, for example. That would obviously not make any difference to the embedded emissions part of the calculation. But there's a world in which there might be conditions applied, but it's hard to think of what could credibly mitigate the emissions impact of an oil field that will create 200 million tonnes of CO2, which is what Rosebank is expected to do.
Cleaning Up is brought to you by the members of our leadership circle. That's Actis, Alcazar Energy, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Eurelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, STCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.
Let's have a little bit more of a think then about the UK in the context internationally. You've talked about why it's so important that the UK has got a history of creating good precedents that are followed internationally, but it does feel like we're in a very difficult set of circumstances right now. And how much of an effect has the change of leadership in the US had? Are you feeling the effects of that in the UK as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure that anyone's escaped the effects of the new leadership in the US. But certainly, I think that the rhetoric and of course, the actual action that's been taken by the new administration in the US, together with the signals that it's sent that have led to rollbacks of voluntary commitments, across different sectors as well, to taking climate change seriously. That's been very unhelpful at a time when, I think for the first time since the Climate Change Act was passed, the kind of cross-party consensus on climate change in the UK was already starting to feel a bit fragile. And I think that's now broken down altogether, with the Conservative Party leadership now calling into question the net zero target for 2050, despite the Conservative Party being the party that introduced that target, when it was in government. And of course, there's the effect of Reform UK, the sort of right-wing populist party in the UK, which is currently polling ahead of either of the major parties. And it's vociferously anti-net zero rhetoric. And it's, I think its mission to make a fight about net zero a key part of the next general election and the national elections that are due to happen next year in Scotland and Wales. So all of those factors together, I think, have also emboldened voices in the media that have reasons, vested interests or other reasons to be skeptical of this agenda. I think there's been a really palpable shift in the way that the sort of political courage or confidence in this agenda. But I will say that that's all happening at the same time as, we've just had a record-breaking spring in terms of how dry it's been. I think we've had the driest, hottest June on record in the UK. The heat waves have been crazy in London, and I think 4 parts of the country have been declared as being in drought recently. So the impacts of climate change are incontrovertible and, unarguable. And that's happening at the same time as this attempt to undermine consensus and support for climate change is happening. And, I think one thing that is quite remarkable is that on the whole, the level of public support for action in climate change, if you look at the polling, has held pretty steady, and it's been pretty high in terms of it being a sort of top 5-ish issue for voters, regardless of demographic or, geography or voting intention in the UK. So I still think there's a really robust foundation to build on in the UK. And of course, when it again comes to the economics, and this is where I think reform, for example, is going to run into challenges in government, is, even where it's got leadership of local councils, it's in constituencies where actually the net zero economy is providing jobs. So if it wants to directly undermine the material interests of its constituents, then it can see how that, plays out for it politically. But the offshore wind industry, as you said, in the UK is world leading. We've got 1/5, I think, of global offshore wind capacity, and there is an opportunity for the UK, given its targets for renewables deployments, to build a serious manufacturing base. We think it needs to do much more to kind of encourage the development of that in the UK, but that will lead to long-term jobs. It will revitalise communities. It will ultimately make the politics of turning away from net zero and climate change much, much harder.
I think about the way that this is playing out in the US, and it's got so ideological and so divorced from facts and reality. It is just about headlines and photo opportunities and kind of vibes, and the vibe at the moment is, we have to be secure, we need to be strong, we need to defend ourselves. It's harking back to some sort of era of industrial strength. And is that what's playing out in the UK, or is it I worry that being right but not actually tapping into emotion in some way, being intellectually correct but failing to see that this is now a fight about hearts and minds, hearts rather than minds, means that we lose? Is that a risk?
Absolutely. And I think as a sector, the challenge has always been to just default to the facts and the science, and to not engage with people about values and the narratives that really speak to them. I think part of what's been driving popularity for reform is, in part, there are various reasons why people are voting for them, but is a sense that the system's broken, that, the UK's economy is stagnating, that the opportunities aren't there, that there are communities in different parts of the country that have been neglected or that haven't shared in the wealth being generated in other parts of the country. And that's actually why I think that the transition for the North Sea oil and gas industry is, again, an opportunity to prove that this is a transition that can work for communities and for individuals, and can help them tell a new story about their future and take a lot of pride, actually, in what the contribution is of their community and their work to the UK's future. And, I think the other thing that's been playing in rhetorically to the politics in the last year, of course, has been concerns about national security, and the focus on energy security is a part of that. But, there's lots of evidence to suggest that, having a distributed renewable energy based system is a more secure approach. It is for the UK anyway, where we don't have the option of self-sufficiency through our domestic fossil fuel reserves. Renewables are the path to energy independence as well. I think we should tell that story, but we have to also make sure that the policies are right. And that's why, as much as our work is focused on the phase out and the climate alignment side of things, we are also very focused on making sure that what comes in to replace those jobs and those institutions and those industries, it speaks to the concerns that people have about their economic futures and their livelihoods. And that's kind of new territory, I think, for a lot of the climate sector, is really thinking about industrial policy and political economy and making sure that, we get all of that right, as much as we are trying to be ambitious on the climate side.
I think you're probably being helped by the arrival now of companies like Octopus, for example, where they're being incredibly clever at communicating with their consumers about when there's benefits to be had, right? Whether that's charging your car when the wind is blowing, or even communities now who are within sight of a wind farm. If that wind farm is producing, you get reductions on your bills. And so they've been very clever about keying in, that as you'd hope as a consumer facing organization, that this is something that directly benefits people. Because we have to learn, I guess, the lessons of that boom and bust cycle of oil and gas, which was that, the UK has been kind of left without very much to show for it.
Absolutely. And persuade them that the energy industry is working in their interest and not just solely in its own private interest. And, I think that's why, Great British Energy, which was one of the other sort of flagship manifesto commitments of this government to create a sort of publicly owned energy company, that is consistently their most popular policy. And that's because people want a stake in the energy system. They want to feel like it works for them, and it's not just something that is being used to siphon off profits, in the interests of foreign investors. And so, there's, I think, a lot of work still to be done to unpack how Great British Energy works in practice. But, the way that Octopus Energy has helped people feel like they've got a stake in renewable energy development in those projects is absolutely crucial when people feel like they don't have agency, which is why the take back control rhetoric is, so politically powerful. I think it's absolutely essential that we're really attuned to that.
Just if people are listening to something thinking, okay, this sounds like, there's a really good solid theory of change here that you're applying to why the UK. Tell us a bit about what you actually do, though, because for some people, this agenda equates to people throwing paint at grandmasters in a national art gallery or blockading the M25. So tell us a little bit about that, where you are in that ecosystem of organizations that are seeking to try and change the narrative around this the supply side equation.
Yeah, so I'll start with narrative, since you've just finished on that, Bryony, because as I said, I think one thing that was so striking about the discourse about the North Sea in the UK when I arrived here was how entirely owned by the oil and gas industry it was, and how much oil and gas industry talking points were being repeated by journalists, by MPs. Like, they had entirely owned the information ecosystem, I think, around the contribution that the industry makes economically to energy security, climate alignment. You'd think we had the cleanest oil and gas industry in the world. And so I think a big part of what we do is to try to introduce an alternative viewpoint that is anchored in fact and data about, for example, like how much new production has to offer to UK energy security, how much difference it makes to price, how much is exported, all of that kind of thing. So a big part of what we do is research and analysis. And if you go to the Uplift website, you'll see that, that spans everything from the fiscal regime to production to crucially also jobs and industrial policy and what we think, could be done to support that transition. So that's a really big part of it. And, Uplift also provides the Secretariat for the Climate Change All-Party Parliamentary Group in the UK Parliament as well, which is a cross-party group of MPs who are interested in making sure that there is an ambitious approach to climate policy making in the UK. And, so we're the Secretariat, so we just basically do what the chair and vice chairs of that group want. But often it is just, a question of being briefed by, for example, Emma Pinchbeck, who did brief the APPG recently, who's the CEO of the Climate Change Committee here, who I know is a recent guest of yours, or learning more from trade unions about what their concerns are about a transition. So, it really is to try to kind of correct the balance of information that's otherwise publicly available about oil and gas transition in the UK. We also support campaigns on particular issues. So we are currently supporting and helping to coordinate the campaign against the Rosebank oil field. We don't run huge campaigns against every single new oil and gas project, but I think Rosebank is a really totemic one. I mean, it's the biggest undeveloped oil field for all the reasons we've discussed. It's an amazing encapsulation of how little new oil and gas development has to offer the UK. So that's something that the oil and gas industry is also briefing hard about, and it's important that there are some counter narratives, I think, to challenge some of that in the public domain. But another campaign that we helped create was one in 2022 called Warm This Winter, which was more broadly, again, in light of the gas price crisis that was experienced so acutely here. That was really about making it very clear that at the heart of our broken energy system is our dependency on fossil fuels. And so we worked with, that was really a campaign that was led by fuel poverty, anti-fuel poverty campaigners and anti-poverty campaigners to make the point that, in the first instance, we needed to make sure that nobody in the UK couldn't afford to heat their home, over the course of that winter and the following winter when gas prices have remained really high, but also that the government needs to tackle energy inefficiency in UK housing, which is another reason why household energy bills are much higher than they should be. I think you're aware of this, but UK housing stock is notoriously energy inefficient, and crucially that people should be supported to move away from gas heating, which is the root cause of why people's household energy bills are as high as they are, towards electrification of heating. And that we should also, at the time there was a ban on onshore wind generation in the UK, the campaign also called for that to be lifted because it was insane, and also to shift away from offshore oil and gas. So, we help with these broader public campaigns that are designed to really foreground the voices of people who are at the sort of sharpest edge of our broken energy system, and to help them tell a story about why we need to get off fossil fuels.
How do you relate to those more sharper edged, in your face kind of campaigns that have mushroomed up, right? Often out of just sheer frustration that there doesn't seem to be enough being done, and where, non-violent direct actions taking place, the M25's being blockaded. And is that the net beneficial or net negative to your more moderate, kind of more inside track traditional campaigning?
Well, I mean, I think, we're going to have to wait a few years to really understand the impact of tactics like Just Stop Oils on overall public support. Lots of people talk about the way that these sorts of direct action tactics were used by all sorts of movements for social change that were ultimately successful, and ones that now are very mainstream, like the suffragettes or, the civil rights movement in the US or the anti-apartheid movement, used all sorts of tactics to advocate for their cause. And, I think one thing that we have to be aware of, and we do work with younger activists, and as Uplift, we don't support illegal direct action, but we are, and I am very conscious of the level of frustration that young people in particular feel about how seriously climate change is being taken, and the disconnect between the rhetoric of politicians who say, yes, we're taking this seriously, but then who do so little in practice to actually back that up, and often make decisions that are directly contrary to those sorts of statements. And it feels as though, as climate impacts also escalate, that this is going to be inevitable, that people start to act out of desperation to, in their own analysis, draw more attention to the agenda, or to just express how totally despairing they are when, as I said, they're not seeing the action that's needed. So as I said, with a long view to how social movements have unfolded across history, these tactics have played a role. I also have sympathy for how frustrated people are. Are they tactics that we use? No. But do I think that it's inevitable in a movement for massive social and industrial change that there will be some things that some people do that make us uncomfortable? Like, yes.
As a lawyer, is there something sort of foundational about our right to protest that also needs to be thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think this goes beyond climate protest, but, in the UK in particular, under both the previous government and this government, we've seen an unprecedented squeeze on our ability to peacefully protest. And, it's the decision, for example, to jail members of Just Stop Oil for the police to break into a meeting of the Quakers. These sorts of things have drawn international condemnation from international legal experts as being completely inconsistent with the right to peaceful assembly, the right to speech. And so I think it's hugely concerning, and it also comes at a moment of authoritarian slide in countries like the US, obviously, that we're witnessing, and the chilling effect that can then have on other kinds of speech is something we should all be really concerned about. And I think it's particularly concerning when we're also seeing, the oil and gas industry using tactics. Well, there's a legal tactic known as a slap suit, which is basically a strategic lawsuit that's brought by a private actor to silence speech. And that's, I think, how the recent lawsuit brought by Energy Transfer against Greenpeace US, which resulted in, I think, a $500 million damages claim against Greenpeace US, was described by international experts. Shell also has brought a lawsuit against Greenpeace UK for more, I think, multi-million-dollar damages claim, totally disproportionate to the actions that these organizations are taking and the public interest in which they're working. So there is a huge, I think, disparity in the way that our actions are being policed compared to those organizations and actors that have real power and real influence.
From what you've described today, and from what I know of your work, you're in that active space of influencing democratic process, right? So elections give us a parliament. That parliament then sets to work. And yes, manifesto commitments are really important, but the real job starts after the election, right? When individual members are taking opinions, trying to work out what's the right position to be taken. Ministers are trying to work out policy positions, and you're actively in that space, engaging with those democratically elected leaders. And that ultimately is our best expression, right? Because that's the art in which these policies, taxes, rules and regulations are being created to protect society. So, and that's something that's, I think, Friends of the Earth used to do very, very well, and perhaps has ebbed away from. So you're kind of kind of picking up the baton for this particular topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my view is that you've got to use all of the tools in your toolbox when you're taking on an industry that is as entrenched, as powerful, whose tentacles kind of extend as widely as the oil and gas sectors does. And so that does mean being a credible source of briefings and information and being able to engage with parliamentary debates and policy processes as we do. I think, though, it also does require us to be very sensitive to the broader political and public conversation around oil and gas and energy security. And I think campaigning can be a powerful tool for shifting those narratives as well. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got to kind of do all of those. And ultimately, you have to be able to influence the policies, as you say, that make these political commitments real.
Well, Tessa, we're at time, and it's been such a lovely chance to get to know you a bit better, hear about the work that you're doing. I'm sure we could continue from many hours, but look forward to following your work as this unfolds. Thank you.
Thanks again.
So that was Tessa Khan, founder and executive director of Uplift. Ensuring politics works for the many and not just the few is a challenging game. And unfortunately, the level of resources deployed by the incumbent vested interests seeking to preserve the status quo is always going to be greater than those seeking to disrupt it with an alternative vision. Organisations like Uplift, who show up, present evidence, engage in the process of policy development, and help educate against disinformation, are performing a vital role. The political consensus that supported UK leadership on climate change is sadly a thing of the past, but the risks posed by climate change are very much not. And the UK is poised to provide an incredibly important example of how an advanced economy weans itself off fossil fuels. This is bound to attract attention from all those wishing to keep us hooked for longer. But a better, cheaper, cleaner, more secure energy system is being built, and the playing field is being levelled. And this is being helped by the work of people like Tessa and her team at Uplift. My thanks to Oscar Boyd, our producer, our editor, Jamie Oliver, and the rest of the talented Cleaning Up team and wonderful Leadership Circle members who make the Cleaning Up podcast possible. Please join me at the same time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up.
Cleaning Up is brought to you by the members of our Leadership Circle. That's Actis, Alcazar Energy, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, STCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.